Can the National Park Service add anything to the early farming conversation? Sure, there's plenty of sites that cover war and even adventure, but how about the people who stayed at home? Turns out we are in luck. Along the Buffalo River in the Ozarks of the state of Arkansas, there's a farm that is the result of this period of war and adventure. This one was in operation from 1839 through 1982. Because the original home was made of local Arkansas cedar, a remarkably rot-resistant wood, it is still standing. Among other things raised on this farm, livestock, mainly cows and pigs, for commercial sales were raised here. They were part of the supply chain that made war and adventure of our 1776 to 1815 time period possible. While the Ozarks as mountains are noted for their lack of level ground, mostly being known for their forests, farms like this one along flat river valleys were desired and enthusiastically claimed by the new Americans. Such homesteads, land grants, and purchases were the cause of the displacement of first the Osage tribes and then later more forceful removal of much of the Cherokee Nation happened under the support and direction of President Andrew Jackson. The land was highly fertile, having hosted rivers for thousands of years, and also hosted numerous springs that were dependable water sources for people living in the area. As America expanded west, farms like these would feed early explorers by providing barrels of salt pork for sale. Then those same barrels were sold to the forts expanding the country. Later, that salt pork would provide food to the pioneers, the workers building the railroads, and then finally they would supply the railroads and even later the miners that hiked out from the tracks, hunting for silver and gold. Much is made of the people moving around and pushing the edges of the country wider. But who was feeding all those people? People who held down farms like these, a bit off the beaten track, but close enough to participate in the national economic life, with a few treks a year. To take a look at what life was like in one of these small farms, think about packing up the car for a pretty major road trip and check out the Parker Hickman Farm in the Buffalo National River Park in Arkansas. Oh, and if you're wondering what the heck is up with the name Buffalo River, tune into next episode. I'll get into that. Oh, and thanks for hanging in there. It's been a little chaotic, so yes, I've gotten behind on the writing. Episode 109, Farmyard Meat and Packaged Fish for War and Adventure. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how the new American farms and the well-established fishing industries were supplying meat for war and adventure. Unlike the big, gigantic farms and fish conglomerates that now supply the majority of the meat we eat, and some is also exported abroad, the soldier and the traveler of these years of baby America came from many, many small farms and boats. But to understand how that all worked, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is, while now war and adventure require mountains of supplies, it was just the same back in earliest of America. Sure, the armies were smaller, but on the other hand, the trips took much longer. Just for fun, can you imagine the supplies an adventurer would need to amass for, say, a trip to Mount Everest if they couldn't fly to Tibet? I mean, the majority of the supplies would be for the trek just to the base of the mountain. First, travel to the coast of whichever continent you were on, and then there's the trip on the sailing ship, soon to be steamships, to Asia, and then the whole extra trek to the base of the mountain. Yikes! But this is the sort of logistical thought that had to go into sending soldiers out to a fort on the edge of the country, or say to the future city of Detroit on the shores of Lake Michigan to confront the British in the War of 1812. You first have to supply the army just to get there. You're not even to the point where they're fighting. I mean, just think about the British and the trek they had to make from the regiment's home somewhere in England, and then take a 2-month or so boat trip maybe with some horses, depends on the habits of the colonel or whatever leading the division. And then upon arrival in New Jersey or wherever, they'd have to supply up with wagons and eating utensils, extra socks, rum rations, not to mention the dried cod and plain old salt pork. An enjoyable review of the follies of one such British officer attempting to continue living in the style to which he had become accustomed while pursuing battle during the Revolutionary War can be found in Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, Season 2, Episode 8. There he talks about General John Burgoyne, or Gentleman Johnny as he was known to his peers, and the dangers of too much baggage, including crystal, silver, and plenty of wine. But no linen cloths and porcelain tea services for the common soldier. These guys and their associated campaign community ate farmed meat for the most part, and salt fish too. There was not much in the way of wild game for the enlisted man and those surrounding him. Sure, they had guns, but they were issued a very limited number of cartridges, powder and ball, and that needed to be saved for combat. A man wasting his ammunition chasing rabbits or deer or birds on the wing would be disciplined. Rations, issued by the quartermaster, were purchased from local farmers and settlers, that is, merchants associated with the army, and of course are liberated from the local landscape. These were the sources of the majority of the meat consumed by soldiers both in camp and by adventurers on the march. The rigmarole of being a soldier on the march took up a good deal of daylight. If you think of all the time savers we have today, zippers, waterproof tents and clothing, snaps, Velcro, shoes that come in both left and right feet, matches for starting fires, dish soap for cleaning up, and hey, lists we can all consult. One can start to imagine how much work it would take to get from point A to point B, and it wouldn't leave time for hunting animals, much less breaking those animals down into pieces that look like food. And all the chores of putting camp away in the morning when every bundle has to be folded and tied to be carried. And then there's the troubles of what to do when the leather thongs break. I mean, those little strips only last so long. And the tent, which could be optional, and the bedroll were wrapped up whether they were dry or damp. There was lots of mildew while campaigning along the east of America, both north, central, and south. And then there were the metal pots and kettles. After the cold breakfast left over from last night's fare were emptied, wiped out, and then tied onto or stuffed inside bundles for the next dinner at the next stop. But even after you're packed up, before the day's march can begin, the route must be determined by sun, by eye, by landmark, and by description, and maybe by map. There's not a road sign in sight, and all too often, no road either. Hopefully there's a path, but sometimes there's not even that. And of course, the company, soldiers or adventurers, has to get together in the right order for the marching. In the Army, from the time assembly starts to the last person in line getting underway could take hours. And when the march over land concludes, there might be 2 or 3 hours between the arrival of the first of the marchers and the end of the line. And you can't get moving until daylight, really, and you have to stop with enough time for the people at the end of the line to set up camp before it gets dark. Because that's setting up sleeping areas, figuring out a cooking spot, gathering the wood and the water, and getting the fire going, all that took several hours to complete. So how far could these clumsily laden people walk in a day over rough ground? Often, it came down to just a few miles. So what I'm saying is the soldiers and adventurers of this period would have fainted dead away in astonishment at the sight of modern frame packs, stuff sacks, not to mention Ziploc bags. I mean, can you imagine? Anyway, what I hope I'm making clear, while on the move to get to a fur hunting camp, or searching out new vistas for adventure, or seeking a new home, or just following orders, being on the march left almost no time for chasing after or sneaking up on wild meat. And even if there were, the hunting would have to be organized. I mean, it would be a whole nother organizational task to keep track of. Because if you have your troop of soldiers or gaggle of pioneers wandering off in all directions to hunt things, that is absolutely a recipe for disaster. Having people out there shooting at promising rustlings in the woods? Just imagine the accidents, the near misses, and that's not even including the stray bullets that might end up back in camp. And then there's the problem that animals are simply not organized along a manner that's convenient to people. I mean, when they're even available to be hunted, that might not coincide with the time people are there to hunt them, or even be awake and available at all. So with all these problems and inconveniences, the average soldier and traveler, whether in camp or on the march, got their meat, fish or flesh, out of barrels. If you recall from way back in season 1, episodes 16 and 17, when I spoke of these semi-feral forest living cows and the hard-working farm cows, well, things had changed. Partly. In the southern states, it was still common to have those semi-feral forest cows. Large landowners or those backing up to the foothills of the Appalachians might still let some cows roam relatively free with an attendant or two. Remember those earliest of cowboys, back when it was still 2 words, boys looking after cows. And these cows were still driven seasonally to sale and slaughter. That hadn't changed. Charleston, South Carolina was still a good place to get your salted beef if you didn't mind it being pretty stringy, and probably a good place to get a great deal on cow horn to make spoons and pipe stems. But further north, starting in about Virginia and up, dairying had taken off as something of an industry. On land that had been worn out by growing tobacco or wheat without adequate additions to keep the soil healthy, this land would often get sold to later immigrants looking to set up dairies. And these dairies often served the growing towns and cities and larger villages, especially those surrounding ocean and river port cities. As I talked about in Season 2, Episode 64, the day of the independent professional dairymaid were waning, and larger dairying operations were being set up. The reason these dairies are important for this part of the story is that being a dairy cow was very hard work. Bearing a calf and giving milk every single year for 6 to 8 years was hard on the health of the cows. It tended to wear out their bones with the calcium demands, among other things. But their muscles weren't worked the way plow and cart oxen were worked, and they simply had shorter lives than draft animals, which meant dairy cows were a regular source of beef for barrels of salt beef up north. Before the dairy cow industry developed, cows, oxen, and bulls were most likely to pass their entire life and be consumed within the same farmer village. But once herds of dairy cattle started to be kept, those cows at the end of their lives would be converted into local beef, or a higher quality of salt beef. The fact that these animals had spent less time living and not a day pulling stuff, the beef of these dairy cows was more tender and much more desired than meat from the hardest working cows and the semi-feral ones fending for themselves in the forest. As a result, more of this meat was consumed locally and less made it into barrels for the common soldier and sailor. But some of it still did, and it was an important revenue stream for the dairy farms. Regardless of the source of the cattle that went into salt beef, they all had to be collected somewhere for the slaughter and processing. Cows are very big animals, ranging from 900 pounds up to 3,000 pounds for a large draft oxen. That's 400 kilos to about 1,300 kilos. By the end of the 18th century, butchering cows was not generally an at-home or on your very own farm task. A given village would have a specialist, or there would even be traveling butchers to take on this gigantic job. And cities would have dedicated slaughterhouses. With the rising need for salt beef in America to fuel war and adventure, the slaughterhouses and powdering rooms, that is, the salting facilities, had plenty of work. While certainly not the large slaughter facilities that would develop in places like Chicago and Toledo and other Midwest cities with the rise of the railroad, America was, even this early, starting to develop somewhat centralized beef slaughtering centers in its cities. The place where you got your beef was no longer the same place the cow was slaughtered. It was becoming a rare thing for a farmer to do, except for the more rural ones. And so, The cow of this age often walked away from its home to meet its end as meat. Things were a little different with pork. While cow keeping had sort of divided itself up into three categories, either onesie-twosie for work or just an at-home dairy cow, or a larger herd for dairying, or a herd of these semi-feral cows, almost everyone who had a farm kept some pigs. And as I've explained before, while cows are nice and civilized and only produce a calf or two each time, pigs show up in litters, possibly twice a year, and as a result, multiply rapidly. So any close conglomeration of farms would always have an excess of piggies each and every spring, if not spring and fall. Some, of course, would go to suckling pig for Easter feasts, and slightly larger pigs would find their way onto the winter table, but a local pig drive to a central slaughtering location was not uncommon. And as a result, there were two ways to create salt pork. Households could do it individually with, say, yearling pigs, which, while big, I wouldn't want to pet one on a dare. The butchering and storing of the meat of a yearling pig is a task that can be taken on by a medium to large family pretty easily. Though, as with cows, there might be a traveling expert for the actual act of dispatching. And then the family, or maybe a group of families with several pigs, might take on the powdering or salting job themselves, and then sell any barrels of excess salt pork and occasionally lard. Because, well, at this point, excess lard was still a somewhat fantastical idea. Not that many people had excess. But when you had a fairly large grouping of farms or just a lot of pigs, there would be pig drives. Pigs of this age had to have pretty long legs and be pretty good at walking, and they couldn't get too heavy. Walking was still an important part of life for the early American pig, whether it was to forage for food or to walk to town for a future as commodity salt pork, sausage, and lard. The short-legged, largely immobile lard hog would not become the common pig until the railroad, and later the truck, eliminates the need for athletic porkers. These guys are under development in England at this time, but not yet much of a presence in baby America. And so for the suppliers who would sell barreled salt pork, they either had agents picking up barrels from larger farms, or they were buying the driven pigs from a myriad of small farms who had brought their pigs in for sale. And because it was up to all these farms, large and small, to just show up with pigs or barrels of salt pork, you can start to see how the supply might get a bit spotty. If this farm lost some pigs to wildcats, or that farm decided to keep an extra barrel of pork for the winter because their household had expanded, a quartermaster in search of pork for his fort might come up short. Or this dairy farm or that dairy farm might not have that many cows to send to the beef barrels in a given year. As a result, the quartermaster might come up short, and this camp or that fort or this expedition might find itself incapable of obtaining the barrels of salt pork or salt beef they had expected. So salt beef and salt pork were the meat of the march, but obtaining it as regularly as the organizers would like was rather chancier than they preferred. And when there was not enough proper flesh to fill bellies, fish was the answer. Cod was running the Atlantic, and a fair bit found its way inland as well. Now you'll notice we don't have much of a history when we think about American food of salt cod, because as cow and pig production and distribution by the future railroad picked up, salt fish would all but disappear from the American table. And then there's canning, but I'll get to that. But that was not yet. The cod production, the catching and gutting and salting and drying industry that had such a hand in creating excitement about North America back in the 16th and 17th centuries, that was still going strong from Nova Scotia south into New England. And because these fish were salted and dried, they would last. And because they were dried, instead of having to sit in a strong brine solution, water is heavy, These dried salted fish were relatively economical to ship about. Sure, sometimes fishing the Atlantic cod banks was made unsafe by naval warfare, or the processing locations were subject to bombardments or raids. It could interrupt production a bit. But there seemed to be, at least at this point, always more fish in the sea. And no one had to raise the fish, so the supply of fish was generally more sure than that of the pigs and cows. Also because salt cod was strictly a product to be sold, unlike the pigs and cows. Supply issues, that is, making sure barrels of fish would show up, were less tricky. As a result, lots of salty fish was consumed during our period of war and adventure. Not excitedly, exactly, but lots of it went down the hatch. It was dependable. And in those times, and in those circumstances, that counts for a lot. So how did all of this incredibly salty meat get eaten? Boiled. If one was lucky after a bit of soaking and a few changes of water, but not always, and certainly not when time or water were short. While there are myriad jokes about military food and travel rations through the ages, you'll notice there are no cookbooks. No one wrote down the recipes in their letters and journals of the meals made for most people on the trail, because generally they were plain and distinctly untasty, and often cooked by people who, well, had no training in cooking. Over the last few seasons, it's clear that making food, much less tasty food, could take all day, or depending on the complexity of the dish, days or weeks of effort, and it always required years of training to be good at it. But soldiers particularly, and the campaign community, and adventurers and travelers as well, usually had limited or no training in cooking. So the military instructions of boil, add potatoes or other vegetables, was all many cooks had to go with. And if one could cook well, you often ended up working for an officer and using English recipes of the 18th century. As a result, this period of time was not one of developing American cuisine, and certainly not from these meats that didn't lend themselves to much tastiness, even under the best of circumstances. And being on the road or in a military camp, that was definitely not the best at all. So in these years of war and adventure, food for just about everyone, food was mainly fuel and nothing more. Once at home on a farm or a plantation, there was time for herbs and good bread and cakes and forcemeat and sauces made of egg yolks and preserved fruits and ketchups. But for the person on the road, alas, food was pretty grim, but at least there was food. And that, some food instead of none, is why a fair number of soldiers would stick around. Where they were coming from, for a number of reasons, there was no food or very far from enough. And so the dull, untasty food of the road was better than not enough or none. After all, salt beef, salt pork, and salt fish, it was meat. And for many in the early years of this country, that was nothing to sneeze at. No great flavors, but nourishment for sure. Now I did hint that the quartermaster and the suppliers couldn't always come through with these barreled meats. There were shortfalls. Soldiers at forts could fish in streams, and some parties of adventurers were set up to hunt. And officers often had personal firearms. So some wild game was eaten by people in the military and on the road. So next week, I'll take a look at the role of wild meat in war and adventure. Who got to eat it, and what forms wild meat took in the war and adventure diet. And it will address the Buffalo Creek problem in Arkansas and the Buffalo, New York question. That is, how did the "where did all the bison go?" question start? And we'll also get to look at the whole war about pemmican. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? I am doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. There's still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud, or crime. Straight up crime. Lots and lots of crime. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as @THOAFood. But for now, I am all X'd out, and all this information is available in the show description.